A prominent theme in theology is that life is defined by its limitation, and therefore the gods are defined by their lack of limitation. But what does this actually mean? Well, the most obvious way of interpreting this is that life is defined by its finitude. All living things will eventually die, whereas gods are immortal. But gods are also typically described as omnipotent and omniscient, meaning their power and knowledge is limitless, whereas life is defined by the fact that living things can only act and know within limited horizons. I can't know everything there is to know, and I cannot do everything I could wish to do. Human beings are thought to sit in a unique position then, because we assume to be the only living species that is aware of our limitation. This means we are defined by a uniquely human problem, our own awareness of our imperfection. This awareness means that we can fall victim to doubt, uncertainty, and guilt. Our imperfect knowledge and power means that our perceptions and judgments about the world may be false, and the validity of our desires, motivations, and actions can be called into question. The meaning of life is not self-evident. Instead, it feels like an open-ended question. Living is not satisfying in itself, it requires some form of justification. Our uniquely human problem therefore leads to a uniquely human way of suffering. Suffering at the hands of ourselves due to the questioning of our own being. However, our awareness of our own limitation also leads to philosophy. The act of philosophizing can only be done by a living human being, because in order to question and seek truth, you must be limited. If all is known, there is nothing to question. But you also must be aware of your limitation. You must be conscious that you could be more. I mentioned in a previous video that I thought having chronic fatigue had made me more philosophically minded. This would make perfect sense in the schema I just laid out, as becoming ill reminds you of your own limitation. Suddenly things you used to be able to do and took for granted are unachievable. Your horizon of action and knowledge becomes narrower, and your awareness of this leads you to asking questions about your own life and its meaning. An active and energetic person who is caught up in living is unlikely to spend much time questioning the meaning of life. They feel their life has a kind of self-evident meaning. However, if this person suddenly becomes ill, they'll become conscious of the narrowing of their horizons. If they become bedbound for long enough, their life's self-evident meaning is unlikely to stay. And this dramatic narrowing of their possibilities can lead to a newfound awareness of their own mortality and limitation. It is from this conscious awareness that philosophy is born. But what is philosophy? Within the context of the framework I have just laid out, the act of philosophizing can only happen through the realization of your innate limitation, and philosophy itself becomes a means of transcending or being at peace with this limitation. This uniquely human tragedy has its own redemption arc. Questioning our own being may lead to suffering in the short term. However, if we choose to voluntarily acknowledge our limitations, we can use this awareness to create a new way of being. A way of being where our awareness of our limitation has helped us create a new path, a path that leads to peace. And this story is the archetype of enlightenment. With this in mind, let's tackle the title of this video and ask why Socrates was the wisest man in Athens. This involves casting our minds back to the birthplace of Western philosophy, ancient Greece. One problem that faces anyone who wishes to learn about the life of Socrates is that he never wrote anything down himself. Almost everything we know about him comes from the dialogues of his student Plato. Plato's dialogues are not written like modern essays. Instead, they read like play scripts between different characters. One of these characters is always Socrates, who has conversations with other prominent Athenians about philosophical issues. Consequently, it is very difficult to know whether Plato is stating his own views through the character of Socrates, or whether he is describing the actual views of Socrates himself. Throughout these dialogues, there are two recurring themes with the character of Socrates. Firstly, that he is widely considered as one of the wisest men in Athens, and secondly, his admittance of his own ignorance. This creates a very interesting dynamic. Socrates, who is believed, and is repeatedly shown to be a very wise and intelligent man, believes himself to know nothing. But how can this be the case? In Plato's dialogue The Apology, we receive some context to this strange situation. We are told that Socrates' own philosophical journey had started when one of his friends had gone to the Delphic oracle and asked her who was the wisest man in Athens. The oracle replied that it was Socrates. Socrates was taken aback, for he knew that he knew nothing, yet the oracle supposedly represented the word of the gods, and as a religious man, he didn't want to disagree with this. So in order to test what the oracle had said, he sought out Athens' most famous politicians, artists and artisans in an attempt to try find someone who was wiser than himself. But after doing this, he realized that all these people believed themselves to know everything, yet as far as he could tell, they knew nothing. It became clear to him why he was the wisest man in Athens. It wasn't because he had the most knowledge, but because he was the only one who was aware of his own ignorance. In other words, Socrates was the only one who was aware of his own limitation. This is how Socrates became a philosopher. He voluntarily became aware of his own limitations, confident that this acknowledgement was what made him the wisest man in Athens. Once aware of his own ignorance, he had taken the first step to transcending it, for a man who is no longer deceiving himself is less likely to be deceived by the world. His goal in life then became to convert other Athenians to a life of philosophy, firstly by revealing their own limitations, and then providing a new pathway to transcend the old versions of themselves. Within Plato's dialogues, we see Socrates' attempts at showing the people of Athens their own prejudices. Socrates questions his interlocutors about things they proclaim to have knowledge about, but then, through his questioning, they begin to realize there are holes in what they thought they knew. They begin to realize their own limitation. The Meno is a good example of this. In this dialogue, Socrates is conversing with an Athenian politician called Meno. He asks Meno to define virtue. Meno believes himself to be more than capable of this task, as he has given speeches to big crowds on the subject of virtue before. However, Meno ends up only being able to give examples of virtuous acts, rather than the group category itself. And through Socrates' questioning, Meno eventually realizes he does not actually know what virtue is. After Meno's ignorance has been revealed to him, he is in a state of aporia. This is a Greek word which signifies the doubt one has when they don't know where to begin with a problem. His previous confident conviction in his knowledge has been replaced by a newfound awareness of his own limitation. In Meno's own words, he accuses Socrates to be like a stingray, as he numbs and perplexes anyone who converses with him. Socrates knows the doubt that Meno feels may in the short term lead to suffering, but in the long term can lead him to his own philosophical journey. He may suffer in the short term because Meno will be aware of his own limitations. His previous convictions about his desires, motivations and actions may be questioned, revealing the foundations of his life have been built around ignorance. But this awareness is also his redemption, because if he is willing to voluntarily accept his own limitations, he can become as wise as Socrates. By no longer deceiving himself, he can take the first step in becoming a philosopher, striving for transcendence above his limitation. Socrates was the wisest man in Athens because he recognized the importance of being aware of our limitation in order to make peace with it or transcend it. Socrates calls himself a midwife because through his questioning he aids the people of Athens to give birth to philosophically minded versions of themselves. He aims to provide redemption to our uniquely human way of suffering. Quickly, before I end this video, I wish to remind you of the role I said illness can have in leading us to philosophy. I said that illness can remind us of our own limitations to the point where we start considering the meaning of life. This means that illness can be a midwife for philosophy just like Socrates, and therefore I want to encourage anyone who is currently suffering in some way by being reminded of their own limitation, that this suffering may also be the beginning of your pathway to transcendence or peace. Thank you.